My husband used our life savings to buy his mistress a new face, telling her she was the one who deserved to be beautiful. He thought I was just the quiet genius behind our empire, too lost in algorithms to notice his treachery. He fundamentally misunderstood that the same analytical mind that built our fortune could be repurposed for a much more personal project. His complete ruin. He saw me as an asset. He was about to learn I was a weapon. If you're ready for a story of calculated revenge, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Our life, before the fall, was a masterpiece of my own design. Vance Capital was our kingdom, built on my predictive models and his charm. I was the architect. He was the king. I willingly ceded the spotlight, believing we were an unbreakable team. He handled the clients and the press. I handled the code that made us millions. I trusted him with every account, seeing it as a symbol of our perfect, synergistic partnership. This illusion of perfection extended far beyond the boardroom. Our penthouse was a testament to minimalist wealth, with glass walls that overlooked the sprawling city we felt we owned. Julian was always so publicly effusive, draping an arm around me at galas and calling me the brains of the operation, his secret weapon. It was intoxicating, and I mistook his performance for devotion. And then there was Chloe, his mentee. She was a junior analyst, ruthlessly ambitious but smart enough to mask it with wide-eyed admiration. I remember afternoons spent patiently explaining the intricacies of my quantitative models to her, feeling a sense of pride as she took meticulous notes. She'd praise my genius, thank me for the opportunity, all while she and Julian were conspiring to dismantle my life. I saw a promising protégé. They saw a mark, an obstacle to be used and then discarded. My trust in them wasn't just a mistake. It was the foundation upon which they built their entire betrayal. It was a Tuesday night, the city a silent tapestry of lights below my office window. I was deep in the code, refining the predictive algorithm that was the very soul of Vance Capital. The work was a meditative state for me, a place of pure logic and control. That's when the alert chimed, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't a market warning. It was a security flag from our personal high-yield savings account, an account we'd designated as our untouchable future. A single, massive wire transfer had been executed. My brow furrowed, not in panic, but in analytical curiosity. A mistake, surely. I pulled up the transaction details. The amount was staggering, enough to buy a small company. The recipient, however, was what made my blood run cold. A discreet, ultra-exclusive plastic surgery clinic nestled in the Swiss Alps. A place known for two things: unparalleled results and impenetrable client confidentiality. It made no sense. And in my world, things that didn't make sense were threats. My first instinct was to call Julian, to hear his logical explanation. But something stopped me. A cold thread of dread began to weave itself around my heart. This wasn't a random error. This was deliberate, and it was hidden. I rerouted my focus from the bank to our own company servers. If Julian had arranged this, there had to be a digital trail. He was charming, but he was never as meticulous as I was. I ran a deep search for any communication related to the clinic's holding company. Nothing. Then, I broadened the search to any recently created, high-level encrypted files on the executive drive, files that weren't part of our standard operations. One hit. It was a small, innocuous-looking file, locked down with a level of security that was impressive, but ultimately amateurish compared to my own work. My fingers flew across the keyboard, dismantling his digital fortress layer by layer. The final wall of code crumbled, and the file opened. I braced myself for love letters, for hotel receipts, for the typical, sordid proof of an affair. What I found was infinitely worse. It wasn't a confession of love, it was a business plan. A meticulously detailed 30-page proposal co-authored by Julian and Chloe. The title alone felt like a physical blow. Project Phoenix, a new vision for modern capital. Their vision, I quickly learned, was to launch a new hedge fund. The seed money was our life savings. The client list was a who's who of Vance Capital's top investors, whom they planned to secretly migrate. But the most chilling part was the section on their core technology. They had found a backdoor into my algorithm, a vulnerability they planned to exploit to give their new firm an unbeatable edge. They weren't just leaving me, they were gutting my company, stealing my life's work, and using my own genius as the weapon to do it. Every word was a calculated stab of betrayal, a testament to a conspiracy that had been growing right under my nose, nurtured by my own trust. I scrolled numbly through financial projections and marketing strategies, each page a new layer of their treachery. Then I saw it. Tucked away in the budget appendix, under the heading, Phase 1, Brand Realignment, was a line item that corresponded exactly to the wire transfer to the Swiss clinic. The description was just 6 words. 6 words that would forever be seared into my memory. Asset acquisition, the new face of the brand. Chloe was the asset. Her surgery wasn't a gift of affection from a doting lover. It was a calculated corporate expense. They were literally building a new face for the company they were stealing from me, and the cost was my future. The quote Julian had once drunkenly slurred after a gala, "Beauty is power, Alara, something you wouldn't understand," slammed into me with the force of a physical assault. He wasn't just replacing me as a wife. He was upgrading me as a corporate asset. I was the old model, being stripped for parts before being sent to the scrapyard. The glass walls of my office seemed to press in, the city lights blurring into a meaningless smear. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The pain was a living thing, a shard of ice expanding in my chest. This wasn't a simple betrayal of the heart. This was an assassination of my identity, my intelligence, and my worth, orchestrated by the 2 people I had mentored and trusted. The urge to scream, to shatter the pristine silence of my carefully constructed world, was overwhelming. But as I stared at their cold, arrogant words on the screen, the fire of my grief began to cool, hardening into something else. It became a diamond-hard point of clarity. They saw me as an obstacle, a problem to be solved, a resource to be plundered. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten that I was the architect of this entire world. And an architect knows every load-bearing wall, every hidden weakness, and exactly where to place the charges to bring the whole thing down. I heard the distant hum of his car pulling into our private garage, the sound echoing up through the building's core. For a terrifying second, my entire body tensed, preparing for a confrontation. The animalistic urge to scream, to throw my laptop against the glass and watch their treacherous business plan shatter along with it, was a physical force. I imagined the scene vividly. His feigned shock, Chloe's practiced innocence, the inevitable, condescending explanation that I was overreacting, that I simply didn't understand. My pain would become their weapon, my heartbreak a tool to paint me as unstable, emotional, and unfit. They would twist my righteous fury into the ravings of a scorned woman, a narrative they could easily sell to our friends and investors. An emotional outburst would be a release for me, but it would be a strategic victory for them. It would make them careful, and I couldn't afford for them to be careful. I needed them to be arrogant. I needed them to remain utterly convinced of my ignorance. That's when the memory of his drunken words from that awful gala surfaced, clawing its way through my grief with chilling clarity. Beauty is power. Ilara. Something you wouldn't understand. It wasn't just a careless insult. It was his entire worldview. He didn't just cheat on me. He deemed me unworthy of the very concept of beauty, a resource he felt entitled to reallocate to a more deserving candidate. The wire transfer wasn't an act of love for Chloe. It was a corporate investment in a superior asset. My worth had been audited, and I had been found lacking. This cold, corporate cruelty was what extinguished the fire of my rage. A screaming match would be messy, human, and beneath the magnitude of this betrayal. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a hostile takeover of my life, and it demanded an equally methodical and devastating response. They hadn't broken my heart. They had declared war on my existence. My fingers, which had been frozen over the keyboard, began to move again, but not with anger. they moved with a chilling, newfound purpose. I copied every file, every piece of data, onto a microdrive so small it could be mistaken for a piece of lint. Then, I scrubbed my activity from the server logs, erasing every trace of my discovery with the same precision I used to design my algorithms. I was creating a digital ghost, a phantom who had seen everything and left no footprints. They believed my world was confined to numbers and code, that I lacked the emotional intelligence to perceive their deception. It was a fatal miscalculation. They saw my focus as a weakness, a form of blindness. I would now use that perception as my greatest shield. From this moment on, I would be the perfect, oblivious wife. I would be the overworked genius, too lost in my work to notice the vipers nesting in my own home. By the time I heard his key in the door, my expression was a mask of placid concentration. I swiveled in my chair, offering him the same tired, distracted smile I had for years. He asked about my day, and I spoke of market fluctuations and server latency, my voice even and calm. I watched him pour a drink, the picture of a man at ease in his kingdom, completely unaware that the architect of that kingdom was now redesigning it into his prison. He saw an asset he could liquidate. He was about to learn a fundamental truth he had long forgotten. I wasn't just the architect. I was the foundation, the load-bearing walls, and the demolition crew. The game wasn't over. It had just begun, and I was finally writing the rules. Their new face of the brand would be the face of their downfall. My war began not with a bang, but with a whisper in the server room. I approached Marcus, our head of IT, a man so quiet he was practically invisible, which was precisely why I trusted him. He'd been with the firm since the beginning, a silent observer who saw everything and said nothing. I didn't appeal to his emotions or spin a tale of a scorned wife. I appealed to his logic and his loyalty to the company we had built. I laid out a single, undeniable piece of evidence, a data breach on the executive drive originating from Julian's terminal, aimed directly at the core of my algorithm. I framed it as a corporate security threat, an external attack. Marcus, however, looked at the logs, then at me, and his eyes held a flicker of understanding. He didn't need the whole story. He just asked, "What do you need, Alara?" And with those 5 words, I had my first soldier. Our first task was to build a fortress within our own walls. Working after hours, when the building was a hollow shell, Marcus and I constructed a ghost network, a digital shadow world completely firewalled from the main Vance Capital servers. It was my new office, my war room. Here, I could conduct my investigation without leaving a single digital footprint. We mirrored every byte of company data, creating a perfect replica of our digital empire that I could dissect at will. Marcus established secure, anonymous communication channels and set up silent monitoring protocols on Julian and Chloe's network activity. They believed they were operating in the shadows, masters of their secret domain. They had no idea I had already become the ghost in their machine, watching every keystroke, reading every encrypted message, and mapping their conspiracy with cold, detached precision. Their arrogance was the flaw in their security, and I was exploiting it. The centerpiece of my strategy was the honeypot, what I privately called Project Icarus. It was a new version of my predictive algorithm, a masterpiece of subtle sabotage. To the untrained eye, or even the trained but arrogant eye of Julian and Chloe, it would look like my magnum opus, a more aggressive, higher-yield version of the original. I left the back door they had created wide open, a deliberate invitation, but deep within its core, I embedded a fatal flaw. The algorithm was designed to deliver a series of small, dazzling successes, just enough to build their confidence and encourage them to risk more capital. But it was also programmed to misinterpret a specific, rare market volatility indicator. When that trigger event occurred, the algorithm wouldn't just fail, it would cascade, leveraging their positions into a financial black hole from which there was no escape. They thought they were stealing fire from the gods. I was handing them wings made of wax. Planting the bait required a delicate touch, a performance of calculated incompetence. During a system-wide update I was ostensibly running, I accidentally left the access path to Project Icarus unsecured for a 90-second window. I knew from Marcus's monitoring that Chloe was logged in, likely snooping. It was a piece of cheese in a trap. I could almost feel her sharp intake of breath as she stumbled upon the files. Later that day, I watched through a hidden keylogger as she and Julian frantically messaged each other, congratulating themselves on their brilliance. They believed they had outsmarted me, that my genius was matched only by my carelessness. Their condescension was so thick I could almost taste it. They had stolen my most powerful weapon, never once suspecting that it had been gift-wrapped and handed to them, a Trojan horse disguised as the spoils of war. Their victory was my design. With the digital trap set, I turned my attention to the financial front. My nights were no longer spent refining code, but poring over years of financial statements, cross-referencing expense reports, and tracing the labyrinthine paths of our shared assets. It was a different kind of algorithm, one made of deceit and greed. I became a forensic accountant hunting a predator. The sheer volume of data would have overwhelmed anyone else. But for me, it was a familiar landscape. Patterns began to emerge from the noise. Small, insignificant discrepancies at first, then larger, more audacious transfers between shell accounts I never knew existed. Julian, the charming face of the company, had been building a shadow financial structure for years. Each discovery was not a moment of pain, but a cold, satisfying click of a lock tumbler falling into place. I was no longer his wife. I was his auditor, and his judgment was coming. The first thread I pulled was a series of falsified expense reports. To anyone else, they were legitimate. Client entertainment, investor dinners, strategy offsites. But I had the original calendar invites and the real attendance lists. The client dinners for 5 were actually intimate tables for 2 at restaurants Julian knew I despised. These strategy offsites, in Napa, corresponded perfectly with Chloe's Instagram posts from a girls' weekend. The amounts were trivial in the grand scheme of things, but the pattern was damning. He was using company funds to finance their affair, billing Vance Capital for the very conspiracy designed to destroy it. I meticulously documented every receipt, every lie, every stolen dollar. It was the foundation of my case, built not on emotion, but on the cold, hard math of his betrayal. Each entry was another nail I would eventually hammer into his coffin. My counteroffensive couldn't just be defensive. It had to be proactive. It was time to introduce paranoia into their perfect partnership. I used a heavily anonymized VPN to leak a carefully worded tip to a notoriously gossipy financial blogger. The post was vague, speaking of rumblings about a new, unvetted hedge fund leveraging unstable algorithmic technology and being run by cowboy traders, poached from an established firm. I mentioned no names, but the description was tailored to sound just like their Project Phoenix. It was a ghost story designed to haunt them. The post caused a minor stir in the industry, just enough to put them on edge. It was a shot fired in the dark, and I knew it would make them look over their shoulders, wondering who else knew their secret. Their conspiracy thrived on secrecy. I was about to flood their world with unwelcome light. The effect was immediate and deeply satisfying. From my vantage point as the oblivious, hardworking wife, I observed the subtle shifts in their dynamic. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room. Julian, who was usually glued to his phone, now angled it away from Chloe when he typed. Chloe, in turn, began to question his decisions with a new, sharp edge to her voice. I overheard a hushed, tense argument in the hallway about moving too fast and unnecessary risks. The anonymous blog post had done its job perfectly. It had introduced an external threat, a mysterious enemy that was turning their unified front into a fractured, paranoid mess. They were so consumed with looking for enemies outside their circle that they never once thought to look at the woman quietly reading a market analysis report right across the hall. Their arrogance was still my most effective shield. Marcus became my eyes and ears, feeding me a steady stream of their digital anxieties. He had flagged a series of encrypted chats between them, which he managed to decrypt. They were spiraling. Chloe was convinced a rival firm had gotten wind of their plan and was trying to sabotage them before they could launch. Julian suspected a disgruntled ex-employee. They debated tightening their security, changing their passwords, and accelerating their timeline. Their dialogue was a symphony of desperation and hubris. They were brilliant strategists in their own minds, yet they were blind to the truth. They were not being hunted by a rival. They were being dismantled from within by the very person they had written off as a non-factor. Every paranoid message they exchanged was a testament to the success of my silent war. To validate the lethality of Project Icarus, I decided to run a small-scale test. The ghost algorithm, now running on their secret servers, flagged a small pharmaceutical company as a prime target for a leveraged buyout, predicting a massive stock surge. I knew from my own, real analysis that the company's lead drug trial was about to fail spectacularly. Using an anonymous offshore account, I placed a significant short sell order against the stock. 2 days later, the news of the failed trial broke, and the stock plummeted by 70%. The secret fund Julian and Chloe were building for their initial investors took a noticeable, painful hit. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was a deep flesh wound. More importantly, it was proof of concept. My weapon worked. I had drawn first blood, and they had no idea where the shot had come from. The small financial loss made Julian reckless. My continued audit of his activities revealed he was getting desperate. He had started leveraging some of Vance Capital's core assets, not just cash reserves, but blocks of stock and real estate holdings, to secure personal lines of credit. He was using our company as collateral to fund their escape vessel. This was no longer just theft. This was high-level corporate fraud. He was systematically bleeding the company dry, planning to leave behind a hollowed-out shell for me to discover long after he and Chloe had vanished. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just leaving me. He was planning to bankrupt me, to erase every trace of our shared success and leave me buried under a mountain of debt. The discovery didn't frighten me. It clarified my objective. Ruin was too gentle a word for what he deserved. Annihilation was more appropriate. The next evening, over a dinner that felt like a scene from a play, I deployed my knowledge as a weapon. Feigning concern over our quarterly reports, I casually asked, "Julian, I was looking at the performance of the commercial property on Fifth Avenue. Have we considered restructuring that asset?" It was one of the properties he had illegally leveraged. For a fraction of a second, his charming composure vanished. I saw raw, animal panic flash in his eyes before the mask of the confident husband slammed back into place. He laughed it off, delivering a smooth, plausible lie about market stability. But I had seen it. I had seen the fear. He knew he was compromised, but he couldn't possibly imagine how. That single moment of terror was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever be. He was now living in my world, a world of hidden data and imminent collapse. Chloe returned from her extended vacation in Switzerland looking like a stranger. Her face was a stunning, flawless sculpture of modern science. High cheekbones, a delicate nose, eyes that seemed wider, more alert. She was beautiful, but it was an uncanny, manufactured beauty. When I saw her, I felt nothing but a cold, analytical curiosity. I played my part, gushing over how rested and radiant she looked. I complimented the surgeon's artistry, calling it a remarkable investment. The double meaning hung in the air between us, but she was too consumed by her own reflection to notice. She preened under my praise, believing she had finally achieved the power Julian had spoken of. She didn't realize she was just the new, glossy hood ornament on a car that I was about to drive off a cliff. Their desperation, fueled by their initial losses and growing paranoia, drove them directly into the heart of my trap. They began to accelerate their timeline, convinced they needed to launch Project Phoenix before their mysterious competitor could strike again. Marcus confirmed that they had started migrating their first round of loyal clients, a small group of high-net-worth individuals they had poached from my portfolio. They were feeding these new accounts capital directly into the waiting maw of Project Icarus. The data feeds showed them celebrating initial spectacular gains, completely unaware that they were merely the first stage of a planned demolition. They were so focused on the launch, on their grand vision, that they failed to see the crumbling foundation beneath their feet. They were building their dream house on a sinkhole. My war room was no longer just a digital space. It was a physical wall in my hidden home office, covered in a complex web of flowcharts, bank statements, and timelines. On one side was the evidence of their crimes: the wire transfer, the fraudulent expenses, the illegal loans, the encrypted chats. On the other side was my arsenal: the kill switch for Project Icarus, the contact information for federal regulators, and a detailed presentation that would systematically dismantle their lives in under 10 minutes. The silent war was over. I had gathered my intelligence, positioned my assets, and cornered my enemy. They believed they were on the verge of their greatest triumph. In reality, they were standing on a trap door, and my hand was hovering over the lever. All I needed now was the perfect audience for the fall. The discovery came on a Thursday night, with 18 days left on the clock. I was deep in a forensic audit of the firm's liabilities, a task I hadn't personally performed in years, when I found it. It wasn't a clever accounting trick. It was a brute force assault on our entire corporate structure. A massive, 9-figure loan agreement with a notoriously aggressive private equity lender. The collateral listed was not just a portion of our assets, but the entirety of Vance Capital itself. Every stock, every bond, every real estate holding, every line of my code. The loan had been taken out 6 weeks ago, and the first and only balloon payment was due in less than 3 weeks. A default would trigger an immediate, hostile seizure of the firm. It was a corporate death sentence, signed and delivered. My world, which had been tilting, was now in a freefall. My blood ran cold as I scrolled to the signature page. It was my name, a flawless digital forgery of my signature, authorizing Julian as the sole executor of the power of attorney. The document was a masterpiece of fraud, legally airtight on the surface. He hadn't just stolen our savings. He had mortgaged our entire empire. His plan was suddenly, horrifically clear. He and Chloe weren't just planning to launch their own fund. They were going to let Vance Capital default. They would walk away with their stolen clients and seed money, leaving me to face the public humiliation, the legal fallout, and the complete bankruptcy of the company I had built from nothing. He wasn't just erasing me from his future. He was trying to erase my past, my present, and any hope of a future. This was no longer a matter of revenge. This was survival. The luxury of a slow, methodical dismantling was gone. The chess game had become a bomb disposal, and the timer was screaming in my ears. For a brief, terrifying moment, the sheer scale of his treachery threatened to overwhelm me. My carefully constructed calm fractured, and raw, primal fear seeped in. He had outmaneuvered me. While I was setting my elegant traps, he had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of the entire building. I could expose him right now, call the authorities, and show them the forgery. But the scandal would trigger a crisis of confidence. The bank would call the loan, investors would flee, and the company would implode anyway. He had created a situation where my only immediate move was to let him win. He had turned my own creation into a hostage, but fear, like grief, is an emotion, and emotions are data points to be analyzed. I pushed the panic down, forcing my mind back to the cold, hard logic of the problem. He had created a binary outcome, my ruin or his. There was no middle ground. This new, desperate variable didn't change my objective. It simply accelerated the timeline and raised the stakes to an existential level. I had been planning a public execution. Now, I had to ensure the patient survived the surgery. My mission was twofold: disarm the bomb he had planted while simultaneously ensuring his public and financial annihilation was absolute. The gala, now just 2 weeks away, was no longer just a stage for my revenge. It was the deadline. It was the last possible moment I could save my company and destroy him in a single, decisive blow. The pressure must have been getting to Julian as well. His charm, once so effortless, was now brittle, stretched thin over a foundation of raw panic. The small losses from my sabotaged algorithm, combined with the anonymous blog post, had clearly spooked their initial investors. I saw it in the way he paced the penthouse at night, his phone calls becoming clipped and harsh. He and Chloe were no longer co-conspirators sharing a triumphant secret. They were partners in a high-stakes crime that was starting to unravel at the edges. They were bleeding capital and credibility before they had even officially launched. Their arrogance was curdling into desperation, and I knew that a desperate man was a dangerous one. I braced myself, knowing his next move would be an attack not on the company, but on me. His first salvo was a subtle campaign of professional gaslighting. In an executive team meeting, while I was presenting a complex market projection, he interrupted me. "Alara, darling, are you sure about that calculation? You seem a bit distracted lately. Maybe you should let the junior team double-check those figures." It was a masterful performance. His tone was one of loving concern, but the message to everyone in the room was clear. The genius is slipping. He was planting seeds of doubt about my competence, laying the groundwork to paint me as an unstable, emotional woman who was losing her grip. It was a classic, cowardly tactic, designed to erode my authority from within. The team exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time in my own boardroom, I felt like an outsider. Chloe, ever the loyal protégé, quickly followed his lead. She began, helpfully, pointing out non-existent errors in my code during team reviews, sending late-night emails to the entire analyst pool, clarifying my directives, and constantly asking if I needed her to take something off my plate. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one a small, public challenge to my authority. She was positioning herself as my successor, the steady hand ready to take the reins from the faltering founder. They were trying to build a narrative that would justify their coup. When the company eventually collapsed under the weight of Julian's secret loan, they could claim they saw the writing on the wall, that they tried to save it from my incompetence. They weren't just stealing my company, they were stealing my legacy. While they focused on dismantling my reputation, Marcus and I were fighting a different war in the digital trenches. He sent me a frantic, encrypted message one night. "They're trying to lock you out." Julian, using his executive credentials, was attempting to systematically revoke my top-level administrative access to our own servers. He was trying to blind me, to cut me off from the very data streams I had created. It was a clumsy, brutish move, but a dangerous one. For 48 tense hours, Marcus and I played a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, creating new backdoors as Julian sealed old ones, rerouting my access through ghost terminals, and masking my digital footprint. He was trying to evict me from a house I had built, and Marcus was the security guard holding the door open for me. Their digital assault was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand their endgame. They weren't just planning for a future without me. They were actively trying to incapacitate me in the present. This new level of aggression confirmed the urgency of my situation. I could no longer afford to simply monitor them. I had to go on the offensive. My primary target was the forged loan document. A digital copy wasn't enough. I needed irrefutable proof of the fraud itself, something that would stand up in federal court and vaporize any credibility Julian had left. This meant I needed access to the source, the secure communication channel between Julian and the private equity lender. It was a digital fortress I had never tried to breach before. Marcus was hesitant, his face pale under the fluorescent lights of the server room. "Alara, this isn't like monitoring our own network. This is breaking into a financial institution's servers. This is a federal crime." I looked at him, my expression unyielding. "He's already committed the crime," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "He used my name to sentence my company to death. I'm not breaking in. I'm retrieving my stolen property." I saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear warring with his loyalty. But he had seen Julian's arrogance for years, had watched me build this place from the ground up. He nodded slowly. "Tell me what you need." My quiet, invisible IT admin was about to become my co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar digital heist. The next few days were a blur of caffeine and code. While I maintained the facade of the increasingly fragile executive during the day, my nights were spent with Marcus, mapping the lender's network architecture. It was a formidable system, but it had a vulnerability, as all systems do. It relied on a third-party encryption service for its client communications portal. I spent hours analyzing the service's source code, searching for an exploit. Finally, I found it. A tiny, obscure flaw in the key exchange protocol. An error so small that only someone with an obsessive, near-pathological attention to detail would ever notice it. It was my way in. We had one shot to get what we needed before the breach was detected, and the digital door slammed shut forever. While we prepared for our digital infiltration, Julian escalated his psychological warfare. He announced that he had hired an efficiency consultant to help streamline our operations, a move he positioned as a supportive gesture to ease my supposed workload. The consultant, a smarmy sycophant named Peterson, was clearly an old friend of Julian's. His real job was to be Julian's eyes and ears, to shadow me, question my decisions, and report back on my declining performance. He was a spy disguised as a helping hand, another layer in their campaign to build a case against me. Julian was trying to build a cage around me in my own office, and Peterson was the new set of bars. I welcomed Peterson with a warm, weary smile, playing the part of the grateful, overwhelmed executive to perfection. I let him sit in on my meetings, gave him access to sanitized performance reports, and sighed dramatically about the crushing pressure of it all. I knew every word I said to him would go directly back to Julian, so I began to use him. I fed him carefully curated misinformation, mentioning phantom software bugs that were causing unreliable profit reports and expressing anxiety over market trends that I knew were rock solid. I was painting a picture of a leader who was losing her nerve, a genius cracking under the strain. I was letting them think their strategy was working, luring them deeper into their own delusion of superiority. The night of the digital heist arrived. With only 9 days left until the gala and the loan default, the stakes were absolute. Marcus initiated a denial-of-service attack on an unrelated server at the lending firm, a noisy distraction to draw their security team's attention. As their firewalls flared to life, I exploited the tiny flaw in the encryption protocol, creating a temporary, invisible access window that lasted exactly 90 seconds. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my mind a blur of pure, focused intent. I bypassed their internal security, navigated to the storage directory for Julian's account, and located the file. It wasn't just the loan agreement, it was the entire communication log, including an audio file of the initial call. I initiated the download. The progress bar on my screen was the slowest thing I had ever witnessed. Each percentage point felt like an hour. 30 seconds left. The file was massive, filled with high-resolution scans and audio data. Marcus's voice was tense in my ear. Their security is starting to pivot. They're realizing the DDoS is a decoy. 20 seconds. I watched the number climb. 85%, 90%, 95%. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, primal drumbeat. 10 seconds, Elara. We have to get out. The progress bar hit 100%. I terminated the connection, and Marcus simultaneously killed the DDoS attack. We were out. We were clean. I held my breath as I clicked open the downloaded folder, and there it was. Proof. The audio file was the final nail in his coffin. I listened to it in the sterile silence of the server room, the sound of Julian's voice filling the air. He was charming, confident, and utterly damning. I heard him laugh with the loan officer as he explained the need for discretion. I heard him confidently assure the man that his wife, Elara, was completely on board, but was too buried in the creative side of things to handle the paperwork. And then came the line that made my blood freeze, the quote that I would burn into the memory of every investor and employee we had. "Don't worry," Julian had said, his voice dripping with condescending affection. "She'll be left with the ashes, but she'll be too confused to even notice the fire. She's brilliant, but she doesn't live in the real world." That single sentence was a gift. It was the distillation of his entire philosophy, his profound, contemptuous underestimation of me. He didn't just see me as an asset. He saw me as a child, a creature to be managed and, ultimately, disposed of. He had confessed not only to his crime but to the entire motive behind it. The forgery was the legal weapon, but this recording was the character assassination from which he would never recover. I saved the file, backing it up across 3 separate encrypted drives. The evidence was secured. The bomb was disarmed, its trigger mechanism now firmly in my hand. All that remained was to choose the time and place for its detonation. The gala was no longer a deadline, it was a stage. In the final week leading up to the event, the atmosphere at Vance Capital became almost unbearable. Julian and Chloe, emboldened by Peterson's reports of my supposed decline, were practically radiating smug triumph. They moved through the office like conquering heroes, finalizing the plans for their new fund and holding discreet meetings with the clients they were about to poach. They treated me with a cloying, patronizing kindness that was more insulting than any open hostility. They would ask if I was feeling all right, if the stress was getting to be too much, all while exchanging self-satisfied smirks behind my back. They believed they had already won. They were standing at the finish line, completely unaware that the entire racetrack was rigged to explode. My own performance became my singular focus. I allowed myself to appear more withdrawn, more tired. I made a deliberate, minor error in a public financial summary. An error I knew Chloe would catch and graciously correct in front of the entire trading floor. I saw the look she gave Julian, a look of pure, unadulterated victory. They were convinced I was broken, a spent force. This was the most crucial part of my strategy. For the final blow to be truly devastating, they needed to be at the absolute peak of their arrogance. They needed to believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were the masters of this universe. Their hubris was the accelerant, and I was about to strike the match. Marcus, my silent partner, had become my shadow. He had insulated my personal network, creating a digital fortress around my war room. He handled the final preparations for the gala, ensuring our audio-visual systems were under his exclusive control, routed through a secure server that only he and I could access. No one would be able to cut the feed. No one could stop what was coming. He worked with a quiet, grim determination. This was no longer just about loyalty to me. It was about protecting the integrity of the company he had helped build. He had seen the rot from the inside, and he was now as committed to cutting it out as I was. The day before the gala, Julian approached me in my office. He closed the door, his expression a carefully crafted mask of concern. "Ilara," he began, his voice soft. "I think you should take some time off after the gala. A long vacation. You've earned it. Let me and Chloe handle things here for a while." It was the final, patronizing move. He wasn't just trying to sideline me. He was offering me a gilded cage, a comfortable exile while he completed the demolition of my life. He was giving me one last chance to walk away quietly, to accept my fate as the obsolete wife being put out to pasture. It was the most insulting, condescending gesture of his entire campaign of betrayal. I looked up from my screen, meeting his gaze. I let a flicker of what he might mistake for wounded confusion cross my face. "A vacation?" I asked, my voice small. "But the firm needs me." He smiled, a sad, pitying expression that made my stomach turn. "The firm will be fine, Ilara. It's time to let go. Trust me." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of false comfort that felt like the touch of a spider. I held his gaze for a long moment, letting him believe he had finally broken me. I saw the relief in his eyes, the certainty of his victory. This was the moment he would remember, the moment he sealed his own fate. I gave him a small, defeated nod. "You're right, Julian. Maybe you're right." He squeezed my shoulder, his victory complete. "I knew you'd understand," he said, turning to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, the mask of the broken woman dissolved, replaced by the cold, placid calm of a predator that knows the hunt is over. He thought he was offering me a graceful exit. He had no idea that I was the one holding the door, and that it led directly to a slaughterhouse. He had asked me to trust him, and I would, in my own way. I would trust him to walk onto that stage tomorrow night, filled with his own arrogance, and deliver himself directly into the heart of the inferno I had so carefully prepared for him. The night of the gala arrived, a crisp, clear evening where the city lights glittered like fallen stars. I chose my dress with the precision of a general choosing their armor. It was a simple, elegant gown of midnight blue, understated and severe. It was not the dress of a victim, nor the dress of a vengeful fury. It was the dress of a CEO about to announce a corporate restructuring. As I surveyed my reflection, I saw a stranger looking back. The warm, trusting woman who had built an empire with her husband was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. The fire of my grief had forged me into something new, something unbreakable. Tonight, Julian would finally meet the real Alara Vance. I arrived late, making a quiet entrance through a side door. The ballroom was magnificent, filled with the most powerful people in the city, our investors, our rivals, the press. It was a sea of champagne and ambition. I saw Julian at the center of it all, a king holding court. Chloe was by his side, radiant in a shimmering silver dress, her new face a beacon of triumphant beauty. They were the picture of a power couple, the future of finance. They laughed and mingled, accepting congratulations for a victory they had not yet won. The dramatic irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Every handshake, every toast, was another step towards their own public immolation. I made my way to the control booth at the back of the ballroom, where Marcus was waiting. He gave me a single, tense nod. Everything was in place. The presentation was loaded. The audio file was queued. The live feed from my personal laptop was patched into the main projector system. From this small, dark room, I could see the entire party laid out before me. I watched Julian and Chloe work the room, their confidence absolute. They were so close to getting everything they had ever wanted, built on a foundation of my work, my trust, and my money. They saw me as the ghost at their feast, a relic of a past they were about to shed. I took my seat in the shadows of the booth, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. I felt no anger, no fear, only a profound and chilling sense of clarity. This was not an act of passion. It was a market correction. Julian and Chloe were a toxic asset, a fraudulent investment that had reached the peak of its bubble. My job tonight was simple: to execute a controlled demolition, to short their entire existence to zero. I watched as Julian confidently made his way to the stage, a microphone in his hand, a triumphant smile on his face. He tapped the mic, and a hush fell over the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Tonight is about the future." He was absolutely right. The future was about to begin. I looked at Marcus, who had his hand on the master control panel. He met my gaze, his expression grim and resolute. He had seen the evidence. He had heard the audio file. He knew the full extent of the betrayal. This was not just about his loyalty to me anymore. This was about justice. The entire room was captivated by Julian, hanging on his every word as he began his speech about vision and innovation. He was a master performer, weaving a tale of a bold new direction, a future he was building. He had no idea that he was merely the opening act for a main event that would utterly destroy him. I gave Marcus the signal, a single, almost imperceptible nod. He pressed a button, and on the massive screens behind Julian, the carefully prepared introduction to his speech was instantly replaced. The first image that flashed across the screen was not a corporate logo, but a high-resolution scan of a bank wire transfer. It showed our life savings, a 7-figure sum, being moved from our joint account to a numbered account held by a discreet clinic in the Swiss Alps. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Julian faltered, his words catching in his throat as he turned to see the image dwarfing him on the screen. The show had begun. His confusion turned to visible panic as the next slide appeared, the title page of his and Chloe's secret business plan, Project Phoenix, a new vision for modern capital, displayed for all to see. I watched Chloe's face, her perfect, surgically enhanced features twisting into a mask of horror. She looked from the screen to Julian, a silent, frantic question in her eyes. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, a rising tide of shock and speculation. The investors they had spent months courting were now staring at irrefutable proof of a conspiracy to defraud the very company they were invested in. Their perfect future was beginning to crumble before their eyes. The next slide was the one I had been waiting for. It was a live, real-time data feed of the portfolio being managed by my sabotaged algorithm, Project Icarus. The screen was a sea of red, showing catastrophic, cascading losses. The dazzling successes had been a mirage, and now, the algorithm had hit the volatility trigger I had programmed into its core. It was actively liquidating their secret investors, capital, leveraging every position into a financial black hole. Phones began to appear all over the ballroom as their poached clients frantically checked their own accounts, their faces draining of all color. The room was no longer filled with whispers, but with the dawning horror of financial ruin. Then, the final blow. As Julian stood frozen on the stage, a deer in the headlights of his own making. His own voice filled the ballroom. It was the audio from the phone call, crisp and clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Don't worry," his recorded voice boomed, dripping with condescension. "She'll be left with the ashes, but she'll be too confused to even notice the fire. She's brilliant, but she doesn't live in the real world." The silence that followed was absolute, a profound, damning vacuum. Every eye in the room was on him, seeing him not as a visionary leader, but as a common thief, a pathetic con man who had just confessed his crimes to the entire world. Just as the stunned silence reached its peak, the main doors of the ballroom swung open. It wasn't the waitstaff with more champagne. It was two men in dark suits, their faces impassive, followed by several members of the firm's legal counsel. They were federal agents. I had made an anonymous call to the SEC's fraud division that morning, providing them with a complete, meticulously organized package of the evidence. I had told them exactly where and when the primary subjects of their investigation would be. They moved through the silent crowd with a quiet purpose, their path leading directly to the stage where Julian stood, a statue of pure, unadulterated shock. His empire had fallen in less than 5 minutes. Chloe was the first to break. She let out a small, strangled sob and made a move to flee. But a second team of agents intercepted her before she could take 2 steps. They didn't put her in handcuffs, not yet. They simply stood beside her, a quiet, immovable symbol of her new reality. Her beauty, the very asset she and Julian had invested my future in, was now utterly useless. It could not save her from the consequences of her own greed. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with desperation, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but she found only the cold, judgmental stares of the people she had tried to deceive. Her new face was now the face of a spectacular public failure. The agents calmly escorted a speechless Julian from the stage. He didn't resist. He seemed to have shrunk, the life and arrogance draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. As he was led past the front tables, he caught my eye. I was no longer in the shadows of the control booth. I was standing in the aisle, my expression unreadable. In that final moment, he finally saw me. Not the distracted wife, not the intellectual asset, but the architect of his ruin. The look in his eyes was not one of hatred, but of a profound, soul-crushing understanding. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game, and he had just been checkmated in the most public way imaginable. As Julian tapped the microphone, a hush fell over the room, a collective breath held in anticipation. He stood bathed in the warm glow of the stage lights, the very picture of success, his smile radiating a confidence that was absolute. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, filling the cavernous ballroom. "Tonight is about the future." From the darkness of the control booth, I watched him on the monitor, a predator surveying his kill. Beside me, Marcus had his hand on the master control panel, his knuckles white. I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The future was indeed beginning. It just wasn't the one Julian had planned. He was the star of a show he didn't know I had written, and his grand finale was about to be a spectacular, public execution. The massive screens behind Julian flickered, but instead of the sleek Vance Capital logo he was expecting, a different image appeared, stark and undeniable. It was a high-resolution scan of the wire transfer from our savings account. The seven-figure sum, the recipient listed as a numbered Swiss account. The date, it was all there, projected 20 feet high for every investor and journalist to see. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the audience. Julian faltered mid-sentence, his smile faltering as he turned to see the source of the disruption. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, sickly panic. He looked wildly into the wings, searching for a stage manager, for anyone who could explain this technical glitch. But there was no glitch. This was the opening salvo, and I watched his composure begin to crack under the first wave of my assault. Before he could recover, the slide changed. The title page of Project Phoenix, A New Vision for Modern Capital, filled the screens, Julian and Chloe's names listed as co-authors. I shifted my gaze from the stage to the front table, where Chloe sat, her perfect, surgically sculpted face, the very asset purchased with my future, twisted into a mask of pure horror. Her wide, beautiful eyes darted from the screen to Julian, a silent, frantic scream for an explanation. The whispers in the crowd grew into a low roar of outrage. The investors they had so carefully courted were now staring at irrefutable proof of a conspiracy, a hostile takeover planned from within. Every handshake, every promise Julian had made just moments before, was now revealed as a calculated lie. Their dream was becoming a public nightmare. The presentation advanced again, and this time it was not a static image, but a live, dynamic data feed. It was the portfolio of their secret fund, powered by my sabotaged algorithm, Project Icarus. The screen was an apocalyptic cascade of red, displaying catastrophic, real-time losses. The market trigger I had planted had been activated, and the algorithm was now a weapon of mass financial destruction, leveraging their investors' capital into oblivion. A new sound filled the ballroom, the frantic tapping of fingers on glass as their poached clients pulled out their phones. I saw faces drain of color, expressions of disbelief turning to fury. The ruin wasn't a theoretical threat. It was happening to them, right now, in their own brokerage accounts. The panic was no longer just on stage. It had become infectious. Then, the final, devastating blow. As Julian stood frozen, a statue of a man watching his world burn. His own voice filled the ballroom, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. It was the audio file from his call with the lender, crisp, clear, and utterly damning. "Don't worry," his recorded voice boomed, dripping with the condescending affection I knew so well. "She'll be left with the ashes, but she'll be too confused to even notice the fire. She's brilliant, but she doesn't live in the real world." An absolute, profound silence fell upon the room. It was the silence of a shared, stunning realization. Every person in that room now saw him for what he was. Not a visionary, but a common thief who had just confessed his crimes and his contempt to the entire world. Just as the crushing silence reached its peak, the main doors of the ballroom swung open with a quiet, authoritative weight. Two men in dark, severe suits entered, followed by several members of our firm's legal counsel. They were federal agents from the SEC's fraud division. I had given them a complete, meticulously organized file that morning, telling them exactly where their primary targets would be and at what time. They moved through the stunned crowd with an unnerving calm, their path leading directly to the stage. Julian watched them approach, his body rigid, his face a blank canvas of shock. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was a cornered animal, and the hunters had finally arrived. His empire had been publicly and professionally incinerated in less than 5 minutes. Chloe was the first to break. A small, strangled sob escaped her lips, and she made a desperate move to flee, to disappear into the crowd. But a second pair of agents intercepted her before she could take 2 steps. They didn't handcuff her. Not yet. They simply flanked her, their presence a quiet, immovable wall between her and any hope of escape. Her new face, the one that was supposed to be the symbol of her power, was now just the face of spectacular public failure. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with desperation, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but found only the cold, unforgiving stares of the very people she had schemed to betray. Her beauty, the asset she had banked her entire future on, had proven to be a worthless investment. As the agents calmly escorted a speechless Julian from the stage, I left the control booth and stepped into the aisle. He was no longer the confident titan who had commanded the room minutes earlier. He was a shrunken, hollowed-out shell of a man. As they led him past my row, his eyes, vacant and lost, finally found mine. In that instant, I saw the last piece of his delusion shatter. He finally saw me. Not the oblivious wife, not the emotional liability, but the architect of his annihilation. The look in his eyes wasn't hatred. It was a profound, soul-crushing understanding. He had not only underestimated me, he had failed to comprehend me entirely. He had declared a war he could never win, and this was his unconditional surrender. The checkmate was complete. With the flashbulb still popping in my memory and the last echoes of Julian's recorded voice fading into the ballroom's stunned silence, I didn't feel the triumphant ecstasy I might have once imagined. Instead, a profound glacial calm settled over me. I watched the federal agents lead them away. Julian, a hollowed-out mannequin of a man, and Chloe, her beautiful, expensive new face streaked with tears of disbelief. The room was a tableau of chaos and whispered speculation, but for me, it was a clean slate. The demolition was complete. The ground had been cleared of all rot and decay. This was not an ending. It was a groundbreaking ceremony. The war was over, but the work of building my new empire, one founded on truth and forged in the fire of betrayal, was just beginning. The ashes were still warm, but I could already see the shape of the phoenix that would rise from them. The next morning, the financial world erupted. The Vance Capital Gala Massacre. One headline screamed, "Genius CEO exposes husband's billion-dollar fraud," read another. The narrative I had so carefully constructed was now being amplified by every major news outlet. Julian and Chloe were painted as cartoon villains, their greed and arrogance laid bare for public consumption. Chloe's new face became a symbol of their grotesque entitlement, splashed across tabloids next to pictures of her being led away by agents. I, in contrast, was portrayed as the quiet, wronged genius who had finally, devastatingly, spoken up. I granted a single, carefully worded interview, expressing not rage, but a deep disappointment and a resolute determination to protect the firm and its investors. I was no longer the victim. I was the protector, the steady hand at the helm in a storm of my own creation. My first move was to call an emergency meeting with our core investors, the very people who had witnessed the implosion firsthand. I didn't enter the boardroom with apologies or excuses. I walked in with a plan. On the same screens that had displayed Julian's downfall, I projected a new presentation titled Vance, the Next Chapter. I laid out the full extent of the fraudulent loan, the forged signature, and the steps I had already taken to secure our remaining assets. Then, I unveiled a brilliant, aggressive recovery strategy, a new algorithm I had been developing in secret, far more powerful and secure than the one Julian had tried to steal. I wasn't asking for their faith, I was demonstrating, with cold, hard data, why their continued investment wasn't just safe, but would be more profitable than ever. The fear in the room was replaced by a palpable sense of awe. The negotiations with the private equity lender, the institution holding the fraudulent loan, were the true test. They arrived with a team of cutthroat lawyers, expecting to carve up the remains of my company. They saw a firm in crisis and a woman on the ropes. They were mistaken. I didn't plead for an extension. I presented them with a choice. They could either proceed with the seizure, triggering a messy public legal battle over the forgery that would tarnish their reputation, Or they could convert the fraudulent debt into a minority equity stake in my newly restructured far more valuable company. I showed them the profit projections from my new algorithm. Their predatory hunger slowly turned into calculated greed. They saw the numbers, the undeniable logic of my plan. In the end, they didn't just back down, they bought in. I had turned Julian's murder weapon into my greatest financial asset. Julian's fall was as swift as it was absolute. Denied bail due to being a flight risk, his assets frozen, he was left with a court-appointed lawyer who was hopelessly outmatched by the mountain of evidence I had provided. The audio recording was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a confession of both means and motive that left no room for doubt. His charm, once his greatest weapon, was useless against the cold, impartial machinery of the law. I followed the proceedings through legal summaries, feeling a detached sense of finality. There was no pleasure in his destruction, only the quiet satisfaction of a complex equation finally being solved. He was a variable that had been rendered irrelevant. His world had shrunk from a sprawling penthouse and a corporate empire to a sterile courtroom and the promise of a small, concrete cell. Chloe's fate was a particularly pathetic postscript. Her legal strategy was to portray herself as a victim, a young, impressionable woman manipulated by a powerful older man. But the business plan, co-authored in her own ambitious words, and the wire transfer for her brand realignment made her an undeniable co-conspirator. She tried to leverage her beauty, her tears, and her youth, but the jury saw only greed. Her story became a cautionary tale in the industry, a footnote in the larger saga of Julian's collapse. The face that was meant to launch a new dynasty became a mugshot. The beautiful asset, the woman who deserved to be beautiful, had been valued, audited, and ultimately written off as a total loss. She had bet everything on Julian, never realizing he was just a pawn in a game I was controlling. With the legal battles relegated to the background, I began the purge. I dismantled the corporate structure Julian had built, a system that rewarded sycophants and punished dissent. His loyalists, the ones who had enabled his behavior and turned a blind eye to his deceptions, were systematically removed. In their place, I promoted the quiet, brilliant minds he had overlooked. Marcus, my silent partner in the digital war, was named Chief Technology Officer, with a significant stake in the new company. The firm was rebranded. We dropped the capital from our name, shedding the last vestige of Julian's influence. It was now simply Vance. My name, my company, my rules. The transformation was not just cosmetic. It was a fundamental rewiring of the company's DNA, from a kingdom built on charm to a republic built on merit. The culture of the new Vance was one of radical transparency. We held weekly town halls where any employee could ask me anything. Performance metrics were open, salaries were standardized, and every major strategic decision was explained to the entire team. The fear and paranoia that had festered under Julian were replaced by a sense of shared purpose and ownership. We were no longer just a collection of employees. We were a team of architects, rebuilding something stronger and more resilient than what had come before. The profits, which had initially dipped during the scandal, began to climb at an astonishing rate. Our clients, reassured by my decisive action and the firm's new ethos, not only stayed but increased their investments. Success was no longer a secret whispered in back rooms. It was a shared victory. My own transformation was just as profound. I was no longer content to be the genius behind the curtain. I became the face of Vance. I began giving keynote speeches at industry conferences, my talks focusing on the intersection of technology and ethics in finance. I appeared on the covers of business magazines, not as a victim of a scandalous divorce, but as a visionary leader who had navigated an unprecedented corporate crisis and emerged victorious. The woman who once ceded the spotlight now commanded it with an easy, unshakable confidence. I had spent years believing my intellect was my only contribution. I now understood that my resilience, my strategic mind, and my newfound ruthlessness were the true sources of my power. I was not just the architect. I was the entire board of directors. ¿Te está gustando esta historia? Deja un like y suscríbete al canal. Ahora continuamos con el video. The ultimate proof of victory came a year after the gala. Vance's annual earnings report was released, and the numbers were staggering. We had not only recovered, we had shattered every previous record, posting profits that were triple what they had been at the peak of Julian's tenure. The market, and our rivals, took notice. Vance was no longer just a successful boutique firm. It was a dominant force in the industry, a testament to what could be achieved when brilliance was unshackled from the dead weight of ego and deceit. My personal wealth grew to a level I had never imagined, but the money was secondary. The real prize was the freedom, the absolute control over my own destiny, and the knowledge that I had built this success entirely on my own terms. One evening, I stood by the glass walls of my office, the same office where my world had shattered, and looked out at the sprawling city below. The view was the same, but I was different. The pain of Julian's betrayal was no longer a gaping wound, but a faint, silvery scar, a reminder not of what I had lost, but of the strength I had discovered. He had seen me as an asset to be liquidated, a resource to be plundered. His fatal miscalculation was in failing to understand that I was not a part of his world. I was the creator of it. The journey of vengeance had been a crucible, burning away the naive, trusting woman I had been, and forging me into the leader I was always meant to be. He had left me for a woman he thought deserved to be beautiful, and in doing so, he had gifted me the opportunity to become something far more valuable, powerful. My reign had just begun,